Okay, and we're live. So, hello everybody. Um, I'm on at a later time this week. It's been a bit of a hectic week. We're doing refurbishing the house a bit, so lots of parts are getting painted, which means behind me is a big mess. Um, and it's just been a nightmare as well as the painting. There's been leaks, etc., popping up. So it's just been one of those weeks. But, and also, it's been quite stormy. Last night was very, very stormy here. Today was reasonable. A bit of sunshine, which is always nice in December, but apparently the weekend is going to be horrible. So people are coming online. So welcome away. So once again, welcome to Irish History Time. I have some questions to work away on, but if you want to ask anything, feel free. Just throw it up in the chat and ask me. And say hello. Feel free to say hello. So, the first question I was going to start with today is a more general question. What period of Irish history? Hi, Kara. Hope the weather up in Mayo is the same it is here. Nice and sunny. Bit cold but sunny. Hi Dennis. Hope all is well with me. We did survive the storm, and last night it was very windy. It didn't have a name, but it was another storm. It was another storm. Um, Dry mild air. Yeah, same here. Actually, I know the day after the storm, it didn't hit 17 here. In parts of Ireland, it hit 17, but it was very warm. Tonight it's cold. Tonight it's cold. Um, so and it's dry, fortunately, but I know there's a lot of rain coming. There's a lot of rain coming. Okay, so hello to everybody. A fair few are online already. So the first question: what period of Irish history deserves more books, more documentaries, or better popular knowledge? It's an interesting question. My initial response is all of them because I love buying history books. But I'd say there's a few. The the Bronze Age, especially anything to do with the building of stone circles, stone rows, megaliths, that sort of things. Also, the Iron Age, because the Iron Age is like there's quite a bit of stuff popping up about the Bronze Age, especially say the Beaker people, things like that. But the transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age and then the emergence of the Gaelic people in the Iron Age, I think it needs a lot more work. There is a very interesting book, The Origins of the Irish, by, oh, what's his name? He's American, but he's a professor of archaeology in Queens. It's a very good book. But I think we need more on the emergence of Gaelic society. Then I would say perhaps the later, say, after sort of books between 800 and 1000, sort of after the arrival of the Vikings, but before the rise of Brian Boru. I think there's a lot of stuff that could be written about and researched about then. Brian Boru tends to be too powerful a figure in a way, so he kind of overshines everything else. There's a lot of stuff to be written about then. Um, the 16th century and the 17th century, there's a lot of stuff still to be done. And then maybe some parts of the 19th century, um, like to do with Catholic emancipation, repeal, stuff like that. The first half of the 19th century, there is a lot to be done. There's 20th century history and 21st century history is quite well covered. There are certain topics that aren't well covered, but it's like if you go into say Hodges' Figures in Dublin, which has a huge Irish history section, it's 20th century history is really, really, really good. It's like the earlier parts from, say, the 9 Years' War backwards are the weaker parts. So perhaps, yeah, from the 9 Years' War backwards is where most work needs to be done. In terms of another aspect of this question is popular knowledge. Um, and I've talked about that before. 9 Years' War, yeah, Dennis, I agree with you. In terms of popular knowledge, it's something I find the more videos I make, especially where I challenge popular opinions, say, like I did something on the famine, a long thing on the famine, which didn't do very well. I did a summary of it on TikTok, and about a month ago or 2 months ago, and I still get people shouting at me on TikTok saying it wasn't a famine, it was genocide. The English took all the food. There are ideas that are frozen in people's minds that need to be looked at. People should be able to look at them. But there's other things. For example, when people talk about the 9 Years' War, many people have the idea of the Battle of the Pass of the Plumes, where where one of the O'Moores is supposed to have had a victory over the Earl of Essex, and there's even a statue about it. However, if you look at the original sources and some of the books written shortly afterwards, this wasn't a very big battle, nor was it necessarily a Gaelic victory. It was a skirmish, and the Earl of Essex could argue that he won. He certainly didn't lose. There were Irish soldiers, Gaelic soldiers in the pass, and he forced his way past them. There was some shooting, and all the early stuff doesn't make any big claims of a victory, but in the 19th century, like so many things, it got transformed completely into this big victory. And there's lots of stuff like that. Another one would be um, Grania Whale. I think there's a lot of she has there's very interesting history to be told about her, a real history. A lot of the stuff that's said about her is a bit exaggerated. Um, the same with Brian Boru. Um, so a lot of what we think could really needs to be challenged, really needs to be rethought of. Um, you could say the same about like say Brehon law. People have this idea that Brehon law consists of all these laws and everybody obeys the laws. They didn't. Most of those laws were, shall we say, intentions. And with any law, there's a big difference between intention and um, like what actually happens. For example, Irish people, and I know I'm one of them, we love to when we're in the city, we love to cross the road anywhere. Um, Theoretically, you're supposed to cross at a crossing, and you're only supposed to you're either the Pelican pedestrian crossing or at the lights. But Irish people don't, and many I know in the states that many people, Irish people, are often arrested and discovered it's a crime. Um, in Ireland, it's not a crime, but if you look at literature, if you were 1,000 years in advance and looking back at literature, you might think that all people will cross a pedestrian crossing. So there's a huge gap between what is said in the law and what is done. Hi, Wayne. I hope your internet behaves. Hi, Paul. Dig Gitch. Dennis, I visited the Battle of the Plume site. Yeah, there's a big monument to it. The monument is probably bigger than the battle. It was only a few hundred people. It was a skirmish, maybe 2 hours long, quite small. Okay, just let me take a sip of tea because I'm tired. Now, the second question: what first got you interested in Irish history? So, if you're anyone listening, if you want to tell me why are you interested in history? What got you interested in Irish history? Um, for me, I just know I've always loved history. It was my best subject in school. And it's something I was always fascinated about. Not just Irish history, most sorts of history, except for the Leaving Cert. I found the Leaving Cert history. I may have said this before. I found the Leaving Cert history course very boring. I think because we were focused on the 19th century and early 20th century, a period I never particularly don't have that much interest in. And then for the Leaving Cert, you have to learn almost by heart these essays about Gladstone, about Bismarck, etc., about the famine. So it's not taught in the most interesting manner. But I've always been interested in it. Sort of, I don't know. Is it something genetic? Um, I know some people are interested in for political reasons, but other people, just like watching history programs. And I know there must be a market for it because there are a lot of, say, big YouTube channels, and there are some there are some TV stations. I know there used to be history. There used to be a history channel, but I don't think that does much history anymore. I think it's gone a bit crazy with like ancient alien type programs. Um, what about any of you? Why are you interested in history? What has got you interested in history? I know one thing probably, especially people who are of Irish descent. But they're living abroad or they're born abroad. That's their interest is somehow trying to be connected to Ireland, trying to chase back your parents, grandparents, great grandparents. I know that, like, I have been doing that recently. I've chased back on my mother's side some of her family to a field up a mountain at the very beginning of the Dingle Peninsula, where they go back 1800 years, and there are still people there with the same surname, so who must be very distant cousins of mine. I don't know, sixth cousin, seventh cousin. Um, because my mother's great grandfather, this is like he was born in Kiel, which is just after Castlemaine, but he ended up moving in the post-famine period to Killorglin, and that's where a large part of the family still is. Then my grandfather moved to Glenbeigh. So in like 100 years, he moved 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers. And like his name was Evans. And if you go to Kiel today, you'll still find loads of Evanses. I was there recently for a football match with my daughter. And I asked one of the local players and said, yeah, there's loads of Evanses here. It's funny. Some, even in the world we have today where people emigrate, etc., there are people who stay where they're born. Um, Thanks, Nikki. Nice to see you online. There are people who don't move very far, and they stay for generations. I don't know if this is something about Kerry, or could you find it in every Irish county. And I know that if you go to Dublin, there's always this big split between Dublin and the rest of the Ireland. But hi, Kat. Nice to see you online. But if you look at most Dubliners, they have uh, most they will have some descent from outside Dublin. On my father's side are Dublin. My father's my father's father is Dublin. But going back another generation, they come from Meath. They moved from Meath up to tenements in Dublin City. Um, and you'd find the same because Dublin would have been so much smaller 150 years ago. And then it's now I think it's one third of the population is almost in Dublin. Hi Jim, nice to see you. So it's most people in Dublin would have at least one grandparent from outside Dublin. Okay, another question. Who was the best Taoiseach in Ireland? The more I normally deal with pre 20th century questions, I thought I would raise a more modern question. So, should we? Ireland got independence in 1922, and there were a series of Taoiseach between from 1922 to 30 something. They were not called Taoiseach, but let's count them. Um, who do you think were the best Taoiseachs. Haughey, he certainly made a big impact, and he's somebody who would still a lot of people tell stories about. Um, and where I live in Kerry, they'd still tell a few stories about because he would go around splashing the cash. And if okay, it's pitch black now, but if I look out the window from where I'm sitting, I can see Inishvikalon, which he bought. And apparently, the story is that he bought it off this guy who had the rights to it. And he wanted to buy it in cash, but like the guy didn't want much money. And then he tried to offer him some cash, and he said, "Yeah, just give me a fiver because I want to buy some meat for the way home." Um, he he did some good things. I know. I think is it free travel for the over 66s was due to him. It could be. And I know he brought in the policy whereby money you make from arts would not be taxed, which resulted in a lot of people from the arts at one stage coming to Ireland. A lot of novelists ended up here because the money they would make wasn't taxed. Though I have a feeling that policy has changed since then. But he was quite controversial, to say the least. Um, Going back to the arms, the arms trial in 1970, which I'll come back to another day because it's a big story. And then, like when I was in my teens, um, there was that big battle between Garrett Fitzgerald and Charlie Haughey. They kept skipping in and out of power, especially like 1981, 1982. There were, I think, 3 elections in 2 years. Um, I I was not a Fianna Fáiler. I've never been very fond of Fianna Fáil, should I say. Um, but I would not have been fond of Haughey. I know Garrett Fitzgerald called him, said that he had a flawed pedigree, which I think was the start of their rivalry. Um, However, one of my favourite Taoiseachs is a Fianna Fáil Taoiseach, and that would be Sean Lemass. Um, and I think he was the Taoiseach who had the biggest impact on modern Ireland, in part because of what happened before, and in part because he got lucky. But as you say, you can make your own luck. He knew he got dealt certain hands, and he played them very well. So he, when De Valera finally resigned in the early 1950s, Lemass becomes Taoiseach, and he's from a similar generation to De Valera, a little younger, but he was involved in the War of Independence. His brother was killed in the Civil War, more than likely by Free State people. However, Lemass didn't seem to harbor any resentment for this. And even though he was from the sort of, should we say, War of Independence generation, he was very much a breath of fresh air. So he gets in and he overthrows a lot of De Valera's policy. De Valera had this kind of very austere to build some sort of republic that would be self-sufficient and no one would have much money, but we'd all be on farms and that sort of stuff. Whereas Lemass realized that we needed a modern economy, so he changed the economic policy in making Ireland an open economy, starting decades of very successful attracts. The Irish state managed to attract industries to Ireland. And if I like my both my parents are the generation that benefited from Lemass, because my father he did economics in UCD, then he did a year in art college, and a master's, and there was nothing in the country. There was one job, and he ended up teaching English in Egypt and then teaching in London. And he moved back to Dublin, to Ireland, in the very early 1960s because of the new policy of Lamass. There was now places in the state. He ended up a researcher. My mother, she was a radiographer, and she ended up working in London, and again came back in the early 60s to Ireland. Um, so a lot of that happened. So Lamass, he he brought in a revolution in Irish government, but he brought it in such a way that people, I don't know, it was done in a very gentle way, and Ireland changed. He wasn't perfect, nobody is in power, but he was quite impressive. After that, um, like, I think, again, I'm not a Fine Gael, but I think John Bruton and the Rainbow Coalition did a reasonable job, especially with the peace process and various other things, and helping to expand the Irish state and helping to build a better welfare state. Like, I finished university in UCD. I'm showing my age. I finished in 1988, and I went to London afterwards for the summer. And I think I met. I would go to any pub in London. I would meet people I knew from UCD, because Ireland was in 1988 not an easy place to live in. The economy was not doing well at all, and then socially it was quite reactionary in a way, because, like, in 1986, I remember it was there was a divorce referendum which was defeated. 1983, I was still in school, but you had that referendum which put abortion in the I think against abortion in the constitution. So it was the 1980s were a difficult time, whereas the 1990s changed that quite a bit. Um, so I would say they're kind of my two favorite Taoiseachs. Most of the time, while I've been an adult and alive, I haven't liked any of the Taoiseachs. I know that most will do a reasonable-ish job, except when Fianna Fáil like crashed the economy. Was it 2010, 2011? Um, and then some of them have been worse than others. But I would come down to Lamass saying he's the best one. Um, Anyone have any ideas? Want to disagree? Want to shout the name of a Taoiseach they like? Hi, Jesse. Hope you're well. Ihawa, if you want to learn a little bit of Irish. Conasata too. Okay. No one wants to say anything about any of the Taoiseach? Okay. You don't like political history. It's not something I talk about much. Um, How's that spelled? Ihawa, Oyche, and then Maith. And then Conasatatu is Cona, which is an accent, S, Ata with an accent, and then Tu. Uh, okay. Hard to argue case for our politicians. I'd say yes and no, because having lived in a country like in Brazil for a long time, they had some good politicians and some really, really bad politicians. And I think sometimes you don't like most of our politicians are, I would say, better than average. They're not all good. A lot are very local, too local. But between the government and the civil servants, things are reasonable. I think Irish people sometimes they struggle to acknowledge that Ireland is not good. It's quite a good country to live in. And Irish people are funny because we all hate to say anything nice about the country. We all like to criticize it. Um, but we don't like hearing non Irish saying anything bad about it. And when you live outside the country, it gives you a different perspective. You see different ways of doing things. Like bureaucracy, for example, in Brazil was crazy, but bureaucracy in France, Portugal is much worse than Ireland. And England as well is going that way. So I'm not going to say we have great politicians. Like I don't like most of them, but I think we have okay politicians. But enough of politics, enough of political history. So another question: why were mountaintops so important in Irish history? Because if you go to most mountaintops or most mountains, a lot of them, even nowadays, I know you can get a pilgrim passport. There are a series of like Connacht in just outside Carsavine, Croagh Patrick, and several other ones. They are people still do pilgrimages on them. I've never gone up Croagh Patrick. I'd like to one day, but I'm going to wear shoes. But people have been going up there for thousands of years. The same with Connacht. It's smaller than St. Patrick, but it has been a sacred mountain for a long, long time. Outside Killarney, heading towards the Cork border, you have the Paps of Anu, again going way, way back. Um, Even like in Kerry, between Glen Bay and Carsavine, on Drung Hill, you have some cairns on top of the mountains. In the Wicklow and Dublin mountains, you'll find a lot of cairns on top of mountains, and then you'll find a lot of um, uh, tombs. What are they called? Uh, the same sort of tombs that you have in Newgrange. There are, I think, 10 in the Dublin Wicklow mountains, and so mountains were very, very sacred in the past. Um, and passage tombs. Thank you, Kat. And it's late for me to be doing this, so my mind is going bad. So, like if you go to a bookshop, if you go online, you start trying to find out about pre-Christian Ireland, you'll find lots and lots and lots of stuff. Most of it is not true. However, there's a lot of connections to pre-Christian sacred spaces, and the more I think about it, um, the more they seem the mountaintops seem to be connected to this. And like um, South Kerry and West Cork are the centre of Ireland for a particular type of stone row. And these stone rows, most of them were built by people who had a great sort of astronomical knowledge. And they oriented them according to stars, according to um, one of them near me is based on the lunar standstill, which is something like a 30 something year cycle. But others, while they're oriented towards the stars, you will also find they're oriented towards mountains, towards mountain tops. On the other hand, in Ireland, until relatively recently, above something like 120 meters, 130 meters, there is very little settlement. Um, because it just before electricity, it would have been too cold and too windy up there. Like two, my birthday is just before Christmases, and 2 years ago I was up in Dublin, and my sister brought me up to see one of these a passage. It was a cairn with a tomb inside it, and the weather was abysmal. You're like in Sound County, Dublin, you get in a car, you drive for 10 minutes, and then you walk for 20 minutes, half an hour, and you're at this place. And it's like you've suddenly gone into another world. The wind was really, really, really strong. And it was probably 150 meters high. It is like it's funny. Like above that line, if you go to, I know, for example, in the States, isn't Colorado, Denver, Denver's really high. I can't remember. There's loads of in the States. There's loads of towns that are very, very high, but here there's very little above 100 and something meters. But there's a lot of megalithic and sacred stuff that high. It's I, People wonder why. There's no real answer. Um, Jim, you're saying it's a better place to defend yourself, Jesse. Midge free. Okay, that's an interesting thing. That's an interesting thing. Though I've had people talk to me saying there would have been less midges in the past because many midges, you'll find them in more in, say, the pine forests and stuff that they've planted all over Ireland. You know, these plantations. Whereas if you had the Irish temperate rainforest, the traditional one, there'd be loads more birds and animals who would eat the midges. Um, so these passage tombs, these cairns, dolmens protect against midges. Good for them. Then we need more dolmens. If you don't like midges, don't go to a football game in Drummond in Kerry. It's the worst place I've been for midges. I've been there watching games, and the whole crowd kind of moves around, and there's a stand, and they move from one side to the other side in while watching the game due to these midges. They'll devour you. Um, but getting back to mountains, sorry. The For a long time, different cultures in Ireland over several thousand years, probably Neolithic, Bronze, and the early Gaelic in the Iron Age, and also I'm sure some early Christian, they all used mountaintops for religious slash sacred purposes, as a way of getting away from things, maybe. But this link, which was there for a long time, got broken. It got lost. I think it's semi being reconnected in some ways. People are now aware of it. Some Catholic groups use the mountains, especially say Croagh Patrick, but I know there's other ones they go around for pilgrimage. They're following the footsteps of saints, but I think unintentionally or without knowing it, they're following in earlier footsteps. So, like I've seen in Carsavine, there's a shop that used to sell what they called the 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 a passport whereby you go to 6 or 7 of these mountain pilgrimages around Ireland, and each one you go to a shop and get a stamp. So it's an interesting topic that, in case anyone is doing a master's in archaeology or history and listening, and they are in need of a topic, I think that is something. It's something that needs a lot of work. It's been on my mind. I'm throwing it out there to you more as to make you think a bit. Let's look at some of the comments. Poll. Okay, RT would broadcast the ancient passage tomb at Newgrange. Yeah, they've been doing that for a few years. I think they started in the middle of COVID, and it's quite interesting because though it's very weather dependent. I watched it 1 or 2 years, and it's with Ireland anything is possible. I didn't know it was live on YouTube on the OPW. Jesse, you've lain under collapsed dolmen to escape midges. Good on you. Good on you. Okay, the calendar. Where did it go? It's this one. Dennis was mentioning. He's talking about this calendar. I don't know if you can see it. Hold on. Yeah, Castleisland Castle. I was in Castleisland yesterday because my daughter's now on the Kerry squad, the under 16 squad. So they'll be doing training up there. And I went into SuperValu to get a cup of tea, and I saw that calendar and I bought it. Castleisland in Irish is Ilan Kerry, the island of Kerry. and until the 17th century, it was called the island of Kerry in English. It was a Desmond town, um, and probably it was one of their biggest castles. There's almost nothing left of the castle anymore. I think there's two half broken towers and a few walls. But this hold on, this calendar is the main photo is a reconstruction of the castle, so it will be very, very, very big. And then there's some other nice photos on the back. Um, it's if you go to the Castle of the Island is the name of the group that does it. It's a historical society based in Castle Island. Over the last 5 or 6 years, they've been trying to create awareness about what used to be there, and they've been doing good work. So it's €10 the the get my mind tonight the calendar. If you go to www.castleislandcastle.com, that's where you can get it. But it's a nice. I like castles, so it's a different calendar. It's a different calendar. Okay, Wayne, we get them in our mangroves. Yeah, I'm sure. In like I've been in mangroves in Brazil, and it's not midges, it's bloody mosquitoes, and some of them are huge, and they bite, and some of them buzz, which is a really annoying ones. Okay, so now I wanted to talk a bit about. If anyone has any questions, just shout, throw them into the chat, and I'll see can I answer them. Now, I want to talk now about turning points, key turning points in Irish history. Um, you often see many historians they'll use the word turning point, um, because it's a good way of justifying what you're writing about was important. And like a turning point, there are lots of turning points in Irish history. I was just trying to list. I wrote a fair few of them, just in 5 minutes. A lot depends on your perspective, what you are interested in. For example, if you're interested in women's history, like turning points would be like the women getting the right to vote, the first TD being elected, the first um, the first woman minister, and then things like the ending of the marriage ban. And for those of you who don't know what the marriage ban was, until the early 1970s, a woman in the civil service, and I think in like public state companies, when they got married, if they got married, they would have to resign their job. They were not permitted by law to stay working. That only got abolished in the early 70s. And I know my great aunt, um, she never married. She was a primary school teacher. She fought in the War of Independence and Civil War, and she did okay in life. But she wanted to, like, having grown up in a one-room tenement, she wanted to buy a house, especially for her widowed mother, and she did. And I think she bought it in the 1940s. But then she discovered that it couldn't go in her name. She was paying for it, but it had to go in the name of one of her brothers. Eventually, it went back to her name, but much, much later. So, just those are just examples of important turning points from women's history. Um, I'm kind of look at it more from a more general point of view. Wayne Culshes, um, what are you asking about Culshes for, Wayne? And actually, there was a letter in the Irish. Since you're asking about Culshes, there was a letter in the Irish Times, I think yesterday, complaining that the 8th of December, which is I think it's the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, it used to be a holiday for Catholic schools, But it was also known as the day that all the country people went up to Dublin to shop. Uh, and this person was writing a letter to the Irish Times saying, "Where have all the country people gone? This doesn't happen anymore." I don't know when it dropped out of fashion because now there's so many more shops, people will come up more often, they'll buy online, etc. Um, do you have any thoughts on why Fine Gael has more Anglo Norman TDs and Fianna Fáil has more Gaelic TDs? Does it? Does it? I can remember it would have been sometimes in the 1980s. There was a lady Goulding or a lady, someone with the title lady running for Fianna Fáil in Dunlera. Oh wait, yeah. Why does Evan? Why do Dubliners call everyone outside of their cultures? Yeah, you asked that the other time, and I researched it and forgot to come back to you. Uh, Give me. I'll just finish the other question, Wayne, then I'll come back to you. So there was this woman running for Fianna Fáil for TD, but she was Lady, I think Lady Valerie Goulding or Golding. So, um, and Lamass, I'm fairly sure that's an Anglo name. But in, in, I've never looked at that. I've never looked at that. Um, but I have a feeling it could be that Fine Gael has tended to have more TDs, you would say, on the East Coast, because like they were associated, Fine Gael and Common Gael, with big farmers who you tend to find in like Meath, Kildare, etc. And they were more heavily they were more heavily settled by the Anglo Normans, whereas Fianna Fáil TDs, like Fianna Fáil always generally did better in the West. Though I have a feeling like when Enda Kenny got elected as Taoiseach, I think he got three, himself and two other Fine Gael TDs elected in Mayo, which could have been the first time there was a Fine Gael majority in Mayo. Um, but like, I don't, I don't think it's. I'll actually come back to that. I'll come back to that. So Wayne, Colchis. Um, I looked this up, and there are a number of ideas, but not all of them are true. Not all of them are probably accurate. One is that I think there's a place in Sligo called Cooltraw, and it was used as a stereotypical place, so that's where the name came from. Another is there's an Irish word which I can't remember now, um, but uh, yeah, there is no. The basic answer is nobody really knows, and there are a couple of opinions, um, but then they're problematic because why would one town in Sligo, why would that name give rise to the name Colchis? It's not a very big town. But an interesting thing is, what is a Colchi? Like to a Dubliner, a real traditional dub, it's anyone outside Dublin. And if you go to Northern Ireland, it's anyone outside Belfast. But if you went into Cork City, someone living in Cork City, say in a real working class area in Cork City, they would not be happy if you called them a Colchi. Whereas a Dubliner would regard someone in Cork City, yes, as a Colchi. Um, but if you go to rural counties, like there is a difference. Like I live in Valencia, and in Valencia they call the people from Carsavine, and Carsavine has about 1,200 people, so it's not a very big town. But they're called townies, and there is a big distinction between townies and other people. It's I think people like to distinguish themselves from other people. Yeah, Paul, you're saying agricultural folk. Yeah, that could be another one. That could be another one. Um, I think it's just a name that stuck. It could have come from Irish, it's hard to say. Davy, they're pretty much the same party these days. Yeah, in a way, in a way. Nikki, when did Women's Christmas come into being? That's a good question. Um, I would say it came gradually. It probably emerged, um, like many of our modern Christmas traditions or way of celebrating it, emerged gradually from the 18th century onwards. Um, the like the population was expanding. Um, it was more peaceful in some ways because the 16th and 17th century um, were times of great political violence. The 18th wasn't, and the 19th there was less violence. There was bad things, but there was less violence. So people and then there were more people who were literate. So traditions were getting written down, stories were getting written down, and then in the Victorian period, Europe became more. There was much more literacy, so ideas and traditions were being celebrated. Like the idea of Christmas tree seems to have emerged in Germany, probably in the 16th century, and in the 19th century it began to spread outside Germany. So I have a feeling as Irish society got more structured that this tradition, probably based on some religious slash folk practices, became strengthened, and then people began to write about it. It probably started in rural areas, in Irish speaking areas, and then it spread. Sorry. It spread into more around the country, and then it became like well established. Um, and I think like most traditions, it kind of goes up and down. At the moment, Women's Christmas, at least where I am in Kerry, there is a celebration of it. You will see many pubs that have restaurants, they will offer special deals, like a special lunch or dinner for Women's Christmas. And then there were in the past people would go to houses, etc., etc. So it's a tradition that has emerged over time, but I would sort of put it back to the 18th or 19th century. I will look up it better. Nikki, growing up in Greystones, I was known as a culture from school pals in Killarney. Yeah, many Dubliners would regard people from Bray, and if you don't know, Bray is a town. For a long time, it's where the Dart, the Dublin suburban train ended. But it's in Wicklow, so it's outside Dublin. So theoretically, people from Bray are Colchis, though I would not recommend you going into Bray and calling people Colchis. They would be most annoyed. And it's the same with Greystones. Like, Dublin has spread. Uh, like, in the past, if you were from Maynooth, many would regard you as a Colchi now, but Maynooth now is essentially Dublin. So it's these words change. They have funny histories and funny stories, and they go up and down. Um, Jesse, do you think it's true that Irish travellers originated from the clan chiefs losing their land, e.g., the O'Neills, and their craftsmen taking to the road afterwards? I don't, because I remember when I was in university, a couple of times, traveller groups came in to talk to us, and I specifically remember them saying that the traditional account or legend was that the travelers were descendants of people who lost their land under Cromwell, whereas they were saying, no, we go back as a separate people much further. And I think there have been some accounts going, but they seem to date back to the medieval period. And they have a language that's different. Um, I've never read an academic study of their language, in part because I don't know how written down it is. I don't think it's written down very much. Uh, um, but they regarded themselves as being ethnically different, going way, way, way back. An interesting thing about the travelers is most of the fairs around the traditional fairs around Ireland that are still going. were set up by travelers, like the Puck Fair was originally a traveler fair because the travelers would move around. At that stage, they moved around much more. And many of them, they'd sell horses and stuff like that, as well as metal stuff. And they would, I think they would go into a town on a particular day, and a lot of them would come there with a lot of horses, which would attract other people. And these fairs grew up. Um, like in Castle Bar, I think it is somewhere in Mayo, there used to be a huge horse fair in the summer. And I don't know how true this actually is, but I've heard it a lot. I've heard it a lot. Um, but they say that in 1914, the summer of 1914, as Europe was about to fall into the First World War, this horse fair was the biggest fair in Europe because so many people, like English, were coming to buy horses for their army, Germans were coming, French were coming. There were lots of horses being sold. Um, Again, I don't know how true that is. I don't think people would have been, at least from Germany, would have been coming to buy horses for their army. But I know Irish horses ended up in the British Army. My my great uncle was killed in the First World War in the Battle of the Somme, and we have his last letter. I made a video about it a few years ago, and in his last letter, he's writing to his brother, my grandfather, and he says that he came across my grandfather's horse in the trenches, um, which is a very interesting thing. Sort of, you don't think about it. Sort of poor, like people being conscripted, yes, but horses being conscripted, you never think about that. I know there was a book, a play, and then a film. I think Spielberg may have been involved in it, Cold War Horse, which is about a horse that ends up in the war and it changes sides, and it's an interesting film. Uh, I watched that after having read this letter from my great uncle, so I was quite interesting watching it. But so going back to Travelers, Jesse, they are they claim to be, and I don't disagree with them, um, ethnically distinct. They're not descended from people who lost their land under Cromwell or earlier. They have an idea that they were always separate. There's probably some truth in that. Um, it probably their language is somehow related to Irish, but they had a social function which lasted until the 20th century, whereby trading horses but also repairing stuff, um, going from village to village, fixing pots, fixing pans, etc. Which is where a name that's no longer used, Tinkers, was because of tin, fit repairing tin stuff and stuff like that. Um, Davy, I was told after the plantations forcing people into Connacht, a lot became travelers. Yeah, that's the story, but it's it's not accurate. Um, and it was more the elites, the people who the former landholders who were dumped into Connacht. Um, the sort of land was confiscated, and many of the Catholic, Old English, and Gaelic, the ones who were left, their land was lost and they were expelled and pushed into Connacht. However, and then the land was chopped up and divided and given to Cromwellian soldiers, etc. However, these newcomers, they needed people to stay on the land. They needed peasants. So I don't know what the number of people who actually moved in the plantations, not in the plantations, in the Hell or Connacht, how many moved into Connacht. It would have been a fair few, but the vast majority of people would have stayed on the land. Okay. Um, so I was discussing before I got lost. I I was discussing turning points in Irish history. Um, Obviously, some of them are obvious. such as the Bronze Age, sort of the emergence of bronze, which allowed people, if you go into the Dublin Museum, you can see so many beautiful objects made out of bronze and gold. So the first metalworking was a key turning point, and then equally iron. So you have the Iron Age, and then the next turning point was probably the arrival of Saint Patrick, or Christianity, because I know it wasn't just Saint Patrick, but in the 5th century, Ireland becomes Christian, uh, and we start getting literacy. We start getting stuff written in Irish. Ogham appears, and then at the same time, I don't know whether it's because of Christianity or it's because of other things. There seemed to have been an economic boom. The population grew, more land was used. You start having so many um, ring forts being built, the sign of an expanding population. So the population changed. And then, while you could say the Vikings was a turning point, I don't see that as a very much turning point. The next one I would say is the Normans. When the Normans came, um, Ireland changed. We no longer had our own monarchy. We became a lordship of England. Um, it Ireland didn't change as much under the Normans, say, as England did, but it's still a direction. There was a definite change of direction. Um, and then I think the next one I'd put would be the Battle of Kinsale and the Treaty of Mellifont, because that represents the end of a possibility of another path whereby there could have been an Irish state with a British monarch, something that you could find in many European countries. Um, Instead of a state that would incorporate Gaelic elites or English elites, it becomes something much more colonial. The native elites, many of them are killed, many of them flee. The ones that survive essentially have to change religion, etc. So Meyer, okay, we'll get to him. We'll get to We'll get to your great great uncle. We're still in 1600. um, so after Kinsale, things change a lot. They shouldn't have run away. The Earls, the flight of the Earls was a definite mistake. The flight of the Earls was a definite mistake. I know why it happened, and I know that O'Neill had a hope that he would go to Spain, except the weather was bad, and his ship couldn't reach Spain. It ended up in France, and then they went to the Spanish Netherlands. And then the Spanish king said, "These guys are important. We don't want them to go back to England or Ireland, but we don't want them to come to Spain because we don't want the war with England." So they pushed them into Italy, where many of them died. Um, so the Treaty of Mellifont and the Flight of the Earls. Um, yeah, you're right, Dave. Like Hugh O'Neill, even when he was very old, he died in 1616, and he was writing to Philip and saying, "Please let me go on a ship back to Ireland. I don't care. Give me 100 men. I want to go back. I want to die in Ireland." And they wouldn't let him. All Most of the other ones who went with him, the younger ones, all died very quickly. Um, we were mentioning mosquitoes and midges earlier. Like many of them got malaria and diseases like that. The climate, they couldn't adapt to the climate in Rome and in other parts of Italy. Um, yeah, Dennis, the weather is a big factor in Irish history. The French landing in Bantry Bay too, and other landings that didn't work out. Yeah, Hugh O'Neill, there is I think it's the Church of San Pietro, but it's been restored. If you go into the church, you can actually see there is what you call it, not a grave slab. In the church on the floor, there is something with his name saying he's buried here. It doesn't necessarily mean he's right under there, but he was buried in that church, and it's becoming somewhere that's getting more and more visited. Um, So where was I? So that was about the Kinsale. Um, so many people would say Cromwell was a main turning point. I I wouldn't say him as a turning point because it's a continuation of what started with in 1603, 1607. So the next one I would go for is the the Treaty of Limerick, the Battle of Boyne, Battle of Aughrim, Treaty of Limerick, the Williamite War. That smashes what's left of the old English state. Um, from now on, the government in Ireland is a colonial government. It's a Protestant government. You could say a Protestant government for a Protestant people, as would happen, as Craig would say about Northern Ireland. So you no longer have Gaelic Irish or Old English. You just have Catholic Irish, most of whom are very, very poor. And they're living in a state that doesn't like them, that hates them, that discriminates against Catholicism, that brings in um, the penal laws. They're not even allowed into Parliament. They, it's only in 1829 that they can sit in Parliament. So that is the big, big, big turning point. The next one I would say is Catholic Emancipation, 1829, um, which represents an ending, an official ending to that state, to the exclusion of the vast majority of Irish people from the state. From 1829 onwards, sorry, I have a bit of a cold coming on. My voice is going. From 1829 onwards, they're actually allowed to sit in Parliament. Catholic emancipation also, you could say, it's the beginning of democratic Ireland, whereby you have the Irish people, especially the poor people, are now involved in politics, and they realize that they have a voice. Uh, you could argue that O'Connell gave them that voice. Um, one thing I jumped over is United Irishmen and 1798. I wouldn't exactly call that a turning point. I would say like it's a birth of another turning point. Um, so you have 1798, the United Irishmen. Then Nikki mentioned her great great uncle, I think it is, Francis Meyer, who was a young Irelander. He designed the tricolour, and then he ends up in the United States leading the Irish Brigade in the Civil War. Um, the Young Irelanders and then the Fenians are one. It's a different way of giving a voice to the Irish people. Um, it's a more violent one in a way, because they all believed that you could resort to arms. O'Connell, no. O'Connell was grandfather. Sorry, Nikki. Um, O'Connell believed more because O'Connell was in Paris in at the beginning of the French Revolution. He didn't like what he saw. He was quite conservative in that sort of way. Um, so in the 19th century, because I'm running out of time now, so I'll come back to this another time. You have O'Connell starts showing people like you can um, campaign, you can try, and you can vote, you can make a difference. Um, he's very conservative in some ways, so he's not willing to confront the state. Whereby, if you look at United Irishmen, Meyer and the Young Irishmen, the Fenians, while they were involved in minor revolts, at the same time they were also um, willing to confront the state much more than O'Connell. And they come together with Davitt and Parnell in the land war, and then Parnell is again pushing for repeal and home rule. Um, so that is under Davitt and Parnell. It's an almost turning point. They get there, they open the door, but then it home rule doesn't pass. The land league is successful. Land returns to the peasantry, or the peasants begin to own land for the first time. And you can see even nowadays, look at the difference between the ownership of farms in Ireland and, say, England or Scotland. Most farmers in England are not, they're tenant farmers. Almost all farmers in Ireland own their own land, whether they're big or small. That was a social revolution. It, but it didn't quite become a turning point. The next turning point, I would say, would be 1916, the War of Independence, and then we have the Civil War. And in a way, that's kind of two turning points. Uh, 1916, the War of Independence, they managed to defeat the English and get independence. But then much of what they achieved is turned on its head by the Civil War. The psychological and political results of which leave Ireland in a quite grim place for a long time until the mass comes along. Um, and yeah, so yeah, then you could say that after that, without wanting to go into modern politics, the civil rights in Nickerin, civil rights in Northern Ireland, and then the split into a right wing and left wing Sinn Féin and IRA, and then the Troubles would be the next turning point. But I'm not going to go into that today because we're basically run out of time, and my voice seems to be going. Just let me just look at the comments before finishing up. Um, Jesse, yeah, trained war horses changing troops would stand aside. Yeah, actually, there's a funny story. There's a famous film called Waterloo that was made in the early 70s. And I think they used the Russian or Soviet army. They dressed them up in the clothes of the day. But they had trouble filming some scenes because they would put the soldiers and then they would get other actors to charge horses towards them. And in those days, the soldiers were trained to receive cavalry charges. But these guys who were real soldiers, when they saw hundreds or thousands of horses charging towards them, they ran away, and they did this 3 or 4 times, messing up the filming. Um, Kira, if the French and Wolfe Tone had been successful, what would Ireland be like today? That's a question I'll come back to next time. Jesse, it's one of the darkest betrayals. Yeah, yeah. To get a horse to charge into a spike is difficult, and it must have been brutal to see a battle where not just people but horses getting hurt. Davy, no one would care about Parnell's lady drama. Yeah, it would. It would. Yeah, it's mad to think about, in a way. Like the Catholic Church threw a fit about it, and so did some of the Methodists and stuff like that in England. It's and it had such an impact on Ireland. We'll come back to that another time. Dennis, thanks, Owen. Thanks a lot, Dennis. Wayne, Waterloo is great. It's a great film. Thanks, Kat. I'm having some tea. I'm having some tea. Battle of Fontenoy was better. Yeah, that's another one that's ignored. Okay, I'm going to finish up because I think my voice is going. So I'm going to have to make another cup of tea. My one is finished. So, Guramakud, Slán, Ihoa, everybody. And I think I'll be back on Thursday of next week because Tuesday my daughter has her school concert. So I really have to be in school on Tuesday, not here. If you want to have a look at, I brought out a video last week on Elizabeth in Ireland. So if you want to have a look at that, click like, etc. And then I may, if I can, I'll have another week video out um, fairly soon. So, everyone's saying good. Thanks very much. Oh, I really appreciate all you watching, spending your time. So, Slán, everyone, thanks a lot. Slán, Wayne, bye Sean, bye Caveman, bye Nikki, bye Jesse. So I will see you soon. Bye bye.